On the Mount of Olives, Jesus said there would be pestilences. Some interpret this to mean that one of the signs of Christ's parousia, his presence or coming, would be a marked increase in the frequency and casualties of pestilence. In particular, those who believe that the parousia began in 1914 say that pestilence has tightened its grip on humanity since that year. As evidence for this, the Spanish flu is given as the foremost example. The claim is that this was the swiftest, most widespread, deadliest pestilence in all history. It is said, right after World War I, more people died of the Spanish flu than had died of any disease epidemic in the history of mankind. The death toll was some 21 million people. No recorded pestilence before or since equaled the 1918 to 1919 death toll in total numbers. Conditions since 1914 are seen as worsening. In regard pestilence, maladies such as heart disease, diabetes, and cancer are cited as examples. First, however, we need to define terms. At Luke chapter 21, verse 11, the word used is loimos, applied to plagues, infectious diseases. There are other words that mean disease, sickness, weakness, which apply to conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, which are often brought on by the aging process and not unique to our time. But the word at Luke 21:11 applies specifically to infectious diseases, in particular plagues, that is, epidemic diseases that cause high mortality. Therefore, the question is, if since 1914 there has been an increase in such deadly epidemics, have there been more deaths from infectious diseases since that time? Was the Spanish flu in particular evidence of this, and the worst epidemic of all time? Let us look at some examples of epidemics throughout history. The Antonine Plague that began in 165 AD ultimately killed 5 million people. In 251, the plague of Cyprian struck. In the city of Rome, at the height of the plague, 5,000 people died a day. Then in 541 AD came the first recorded outbreak of the bubonic plague, then called the Plague of Justinian, which killed 25 million people. Swedish medical historian Mats Bergmark said, in Constantinople it killed 5,000 to 10,000 people a day. Through Greece it spread to Italy, and after 15 years it reached the Rhine. There it turned, and on its way back it passed through Constantinople again, having then in no way lost its virulence. It is estimated that the Eastern Empire lost half the number of its inhabitants. Many cities died out. The population of the former Roman Empire at its height was by this time cut in half. The bubonic plague periodically returned again and again until about 750 AD, and it spread to Asia and raged there with similar effects. However, history has never seen an epidemic as bad as the Black Death that began in 1338. At the very minimum, it killed 100 million people, and likely more. Medieval historian Philip Bayleiter said, the trend of recent research is pointing to a figure more like 45 to 50% of the European population dying during a 4-year period. There is a fair amount of geographic variation. In Mediterranean Europe, areas such as Italy, the south of France, and Spain, where the plague ran for about 4 years consecutively, it was probably closer to 75 to 80% of the population. Michael W. Doles said in his book, The Black Death in the Middle East, undoubtedly the worst disaster that has ever befallen mankind. In the history of diseases, a professor noted, almost certainly the most terrible visitation to which mankind has ever been exposed. James Cornell said, the greatest disaster ever suffered by the world was the pandemic spread of the bubonic plague, which killed as much as 1/3 of the world's population before running its course across 14th century Europe and Asia. Major outbreaks of the bubonic plague returned repeatedly in Europe, at least 60 or 70 times, all the way up until 1720. When Europeans brought infectious diseases to the Americas, the effect was devastating on the native populations. McNeill, in his book Plagues and Peoples, said, "Overall, the disaster to the Amerindian population assumed a scale that is hard for us to imagine, living as we do in an age when epidemic diseases hardly matters. Ratios of 20 to 1 or even 25 to 1 between pre-Columbian populations and the bottoming out point in the Amerindian population curves seems more or less correct, despite wide local variations. Behind such chill statistics lurks enormous and repeated human anguish. As whole societies fell apart, values crumbled, and old ways of life lost all shred of meaning. In the Americas, this meant a 95% reduction of the native population from 100 million people to just 5 million. In the 19th century, the world had to contend with cholera, measles, and scarlet fever. In regard to cholera, it is said, deaths in India between 1817 and 1860 are generally considered to have exceeded 15 million persons. Another 23 million died between 1865 and 1917. Russian deaths during a similar time period exceeded 2 million. Before the 19th century, humanity had no idea what propagated these plagues. They had no concept of viruses or bacteria, nor any effective way to prevent or mitigate these diseases. From that time on, advances in medicine and hygiene continued to decrease the scourge of pandemics. Professor Erland Hofstede said, "If the causes of death are considered, one finds that infectious diseases now have almost disappeared as a cause of death. Formerly, these diseases affected people of all ages and were the most important reason why mortality among children and youth in those days was quite high. Thanks to these advances, today life expectancy in the developed world is over 75 years old, though in underdeveloped parts of the world it's 30 to 60. But before the 19th century, life expectancy was 20 or 30. The facts show that since 1914, pestilence has not been on the increase, but rather just the opposite." Leo Huberman, in the book Man's Worldly Goods, The Story of the Wealth of Nations, said, "We who live in civilized countries where medicine has made such tremendous advances and hygiene is preached and practiced know nothing of such plagues as swept over whole continents in the Middle Ages." The book The History of Diseases says, "Infectious diseases, which only 1 or 2 generations ago formed the largest group in our statistics on morbidity and mortality, have been driven back by the advance of medicine." James Cornell, in the work The Great International Disaster Book, says, "The most remarkable achievement of the 20th century may be the eradication of the great pandemics that once swept over entire nations and continents, crippling, maiming, scarring, and killing millions." Herbert L. Schrader said, "The subjugators of pestilences have won the greatest victory that has ever been gained during 6,000 years of world history, the victory over a premature death." In the book Plagues and People, Professor William H. McNeill said, "In most places, epidemic diseases have become unimportant, and many kinds of infection have become rare, where they were formerly common and serious. The net increment to human health and cheerfulness is hard to exaggerate. Indeed, it now requires an active imagination to understand what infectious disease formerly meant to mankind, or even to our own grandfathers."